Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of the courtroom, a space that felt more like a cage than a place of justice. Every movement, every word was scrutinized as though the walls themselves were listening. The tension in the air was heavy, almost oppressive as she entered the room. The echo of her heels on the polished floor was sharp, steady, and deliberate, each step speaking of confidence, not defiance, but purpose. It was a cold morning in Charleston, but inside the chill had nothing to do with the weather. It came from the stairs, the silence, and the weight of what was about to unfold. Jasmine paused for a brief moment, her fingers brushing the edge of the wooden bench in front of her. The files resting there weren't just paperwork, they held decisions that could shift the system. Around her, quiet conversations faded as eyes began to settle on her. She was no stranger to the courtroom, but this day felt different. It wasn't just another case. The unease behind her calm eyes betrayed what she already knew. This moment would define more than a trial. It could determine whether justice itself still had a place in the system she served. Her robe was dark, her hair tied back neatly, every detail of her appearance calculated to reflect the seriousness of her role. Yet, under the surface, doubt stirred. This wasn't fear, it was awareness. She could feel the courtroom's weight on her shoulders. Today, she would have to make decisions that required more than legal knowledge. They would require courage. Police officers and attorneys whispered among themselves, most treating the day like any other. But Jasmine's eyes remained on the files. Her heart pounded, not just from nerves, but from something deeper, the recognition that what she did next could challenge the very foundation of the system. She scanned the faces around her. Some watched with curiosity, others with quiet support, and a few with visible doubt. Those who knew her sensed this wouldn't be an ordinary hearing. Years ago, she had been a defense attorney. Now, seated at the judge's bench, she carried a new kind of pressure, one that demanded choices with irreversible impact. Adjusting her glasses, Jasmine closed her eyes for a moment. The weight of the eyes watching her made it hard to breathe, yet she had never felt more certain of her purpose. And then, her gaze locked with that of Travis Boone, a name that had come to represent the unchecked authority she was sworn to challenge. His expression was as smug as ever, unbothered by the consequences. He wasn't just standing there as an officer. He stood as a reminder of what happened when power went unaccounted for. Their history wasn't distant. They had faced off before, but today he wasn't on the sidelines. He was central to everything. That moment hit Jasmine with force. Could she confront this? Could she stand alone in a room full of silence and make them all see what had been ignored for too long? Her chest tightened, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what was at stake. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for those who had never been heard. Then the courtroom settled into silence, the kind that made people shift in their seats. Jasmine stepped up, not just as a judge, but as someone who could no longer look away. Her steps were steady, though her fingers trembled ever so slightly under the courtroom lights. Her posture was strong, but her mind was a storm. This wasn't just a trial. It was a confrontation with everything the system had allowed, and she knew it. She would have to meet it head-on. Because no matter the cost, Jasmine Crockett was no longer willing to serve a justice system that pretended to be blind while turning its back on the truth. As Jasmine Crockett took her position behind the bench, the room's silence deepened. A stillness so complete it felt unnatural, like the world had momentarily paused. Her hands, though steady in gesture, revealed a faint tremble beneath the surface. A reaction not of fear, but of immense pressure. The courtroom lights were harsh, casting reflections across the polished desk and illuminating every detail of her presence. She looked calm, but inside, her thoughts churned. This wasn't like other cases. She wasn't simply here to apply the law. She was preparing to confront a culture that had gone unchecked for far too long. Every lawyer, every clerk, and every spectator present would soon witness a moment that went beyond the usual proceedings. Jasmine's heart beat loudly in her chest, but her expression gave nothing away. She knew the risks. She knew the cost of doing the right thing in a place that had protected the wrong people for so long. Around her, attorneys shuffled papers. Prosecutors whispered quietly in huddles, and witnesses nervously glanced about. But for Jasmine, everything else faded. This wasn't just about interpreting evidence. It was about defining what kind of justice this courtroom would allow. Her breathing slowed, and she focused, feeling the weight of not just her robe, but the responsibility that came with it. Then, like a sudden spark in a room filled with gas, it happened. Without warning, Travis Boone stepped forward and struck her. A slap, sharp, loud, and deliberate. His hand hit her face with such force that the sound echoed off the stone walls. In a single second, the courtroom shifted from tension to disbelief. The act was fast, but its impact landed like a punch, across the chest of every person watching. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't step back. Her cheek burned where the blow had landed, but her body remained upright, frozen, her eyes locked on Boone. Her mind raced, not from confusion, but from control. The humiliation, the pain. It all surged at once, but she didn't allow it to break her. She refused to give him that power. Around her, the room was in stunned silence. No one moved, no one spoke. Faces reflected shock, fear, and helplessness. This wasn't just a physical assault, it was symbolic. A statement meant to humiliate, to degrade, and to remind her who held unchecked power. But Jasmine saw more. She saw the truth behind the act. This wasn't just about her. Boone's slap was the result of a system that had allowed him to act without fear of consequence for far too long. It was a system that had protected him, validated him, and looked the other way every time he crossed the line. Still, Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her gaze fixed on him. Her face stung, her chest ached, but she didn't lower her eyes. This wasn't the time for anger. Not yet. It was a moment. For clarity. For calculation. If she reacted with emotion, she would give them what they wanted, an excuse to dismiss her. But if she responded with resolve, she would take the first step toward changing the narrative. Her fingers slowly rose to touch her cheek, not to wipe away the pain, but to acknowledge it. She didn't hide what had happened. She accepted it, made it real. She let it be seen. The room watched her, waiting, expecting either collapse or outrage, but Jasmine gave them something else entirely. She broke the silence, not with a cry, but with her voice, cold, controlled, precise. Travis. Boone, you just struck me in this courtroom, she said, each word deliberate, and I will not let this go unnoticed. The effect was immediate. The tension snapped. What had been stillness became stunned awareness. There was no going back now. Jasmine had made her stand, and the entire courtroom knew it. She stepped. Down, slow and steady, her eyes never leaving Boone. She wasn't just responding to violence, she was answering the system that enabled it. Jasmine Crockett walked steadily out of the courtroom, her steps controlled despite the turmoil inside. As the door closed behind her with a soft but final click, she entered the break room, a space meant for rest, now feeling like a quiet refuge from the chaos she had just faced. The silence here was different, not the tense stillness of the courtroom, but a deeper, heavier quiet, one that carried the weight of reflection and the burden of what came next. She moved straight to the wooden chair by the wall, sat down slowly, and began to unbutton her judge's robe. The fabric slid off with a deliberate calmness, folded neatly and placed on the table. It wasn't just a routine gesture, it was symbolic, a moment of pause, a shedding of roles, as she prepared herself for the next phase of this fight. With her elbows on the table, Jasmine closed her eyes and let herself feel everything for just a moment. The burn on her cheek lingered, but she didn't focus on the pain. Her mind wasn't on what had just happened. It was on what it meant. The slap wasn't personal, not really. It was a message, and not just to her. It was meant to silence anyone who dared to question authority, to remind them of who the system protected. Jasmine opened her eyes and looked into the mirror across the room. Her appearance remained composed, hair still tidy, expression still unreadable, but her eyes betrayed what she carried inside. They reflected exhaustion, yes, but also something more dangerous to those in power. Conviction. She wasn't just reacting to the slap. She was reacting to a system that had been built to protect people like Boone. If she let it go, if she chose silence now, she wouldn't just be betraying herself. She'd be joining the very forces she had spent her life resisting, and that wasn't an option. Standing up, Jasmine walked to the window. Outside, Charleston glowed under the dimming afternoon sun, but inside her there was no lightness, only the growing weight of everything she now knew she had to do. This fight wasn't about one officer or one courtroom. It was about a system, built to shield itself, to erase its mistakes, and to survive by turning away from justice. Her eyes drifted to the stack of files she had left on the table. Every page, every case, represented decisions she had made within the bounds of a system she was no longer sure she could trust. But now, something had shifted. She could no longer separate herself from the harm it allowed. If she didn't act, she would become the part of the silence that had let this go on for too long. Jasmine reached into a drawer and pulled out a notebook, the one she used only for her most critical thoughts. She began to write. Not ideas for a press statement, not courtroom notes. This was strategy. This was planning. Names, connections, suspicions, all of it went onto the page. She wasn't simply going to speak up. She was going to dismantle this. But even as she wrote, she knew she couldn't do it alone. The system was too broad, too deeply rooted. She needed people willing to stand beside her, people who wouldn't flinch when the pressure came, because it would come, and it would come hard. Jasmine paused, eyes scanning what she had written. She didn't feel fear. She felt ready. This was the beginning, not of a courtroom trial, but of a confrontation with the truth that had long been buried. And Jasmine Crockett, in this quiet moment, had made her decision. She would not be stopped. By the time Jasmine stepped back into her chambers, word of the incident had already begun to circulate through the courthouse. Conversations paused when she passed. Staff exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of shock, concern, and discomfort. Some avoided her gaze entirely. Others looked at her differently, not out of pity, but with a quiet kind of respect. No one needed to say anything. The slap had become a shared reality, something no one could pretend hadn't happened. But Jasmine wasn't interested in sympathy. What she wanted, what she needed, was accountability. She had spent too long watching injustice get reduced to whispers behind closed doors, and she refused to be part of that cycle. As she shut the door to her office behind her, the weight of the silence returned. Yet this time it felt different. It felt not paralyzing, but clarifying. She sat behind her desk, eyes scanning the wall lined with past commendations and framed degrees. Achievements that once felt meaningful now seemed distant. She had earned every piece of recognition in that room, but today reminded her that credentials alone couldn't protect you, not when truth threatened power. Jasmine reached for her phone. She wasn't calling for backup. She was calling for information, for clarity. She needed to know just how far this went, who had enabled Boone, who had looked away, and who had helped protect the silence. Her first call was to Internal Affairs. She didn't make accusations. She asked questions. Calm, pointed questions about past complaints, records, and disciplinary action against Boone. The tone on the other end shifted quickly. What began as polite formalities turned into hesitant replies. "That's not something I can release right now." "There are procedures for that, Judge. I'll have to check with legal." But Jasmine had dealt with bureaucracy long. enough to know when someone was dodging. She thanked them and hung up, noting the time, the name, and the hesitation. Then she made her second call, not to a colleague but to someone outside the courthouse, someone who had once worked on the Boone investigation before being quietly reassigned. Their voice cracked slightly when they answered. "Judge Crockett?" Jasmine didn't waste time. "I need everything you couldn't say before," she said plainly. "Off the record, just facts." There was a pause, a long one. Then, "You're not going to be able to stay neutral after this," the voice said. "They'll come after you." "I'm not trying to stay neutral," Jasmine replied. "I'm trying to do what's right." The conversation lasted only 10 minutes, but what she learned in that time shifted her entire understanding of the courtroom she had returned to. Boone wasn't just protected, he was insulated. Complaints had vanished, body cam footage had gone missing, and every attempt at oversight had been quietly shut down before it reached the surface. When she hung up, Jasmine leaned back in her chair. Her fingers tapped slowly against the desk. Everything was starting to fit together, and the image forming was one of systemic failure, of silence used as a tool of preservation, not peace. She opened her drawer, pulled out her old recorder, and placed it on the desk. If they wanted silence, they'd soon understand that they had misjudged her completely, because she wasn't preparing a complaint. She was preparing a case. The recorder sat on her desk like a quiet witness, its red light blinking steadily. Jasmine pressed the button and spoke clearly. "This is Judge Jasmine Crockett. Today, I'm beginning a formal documentation of misconduct involving Officer Travis Boone and potentially others within this system." Her voice was calm, not cold. She wasn't trying to dramatize anything. She was setting the record, because she knew that once this started, it couldn't be undone. She laid out the facts, the incident in the courtroom, the slap, the response, or lack thereof, the immediate silence from court security, the shift in energy from her colleagues. She spoke methodically, like someone narrating a scene as much for history as for evidence. There was no speculation, no emotion, just what had happened and what followed. Next, she outlined the conversation she had just had with the former investigator. She didn't name names, not yet, but she laid out the patterns. Missing reports, blocked transfers, dismissed complaints. Jasmine was building something, brick by brick. Not a narrative, but a foundation, one that could hold under scrutiny. As the recorder clicked off, she leaned back in her chair. The quiet in the room felt different now. Not like retreat, but readiness. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was moving. Her next step was subtle. She began revisiting past cases Boone had been involved in. She'd presided over several without knowing the extent of what he'd done outside the courtroom. Now, she read them with new eyes. Use of force, reports, arrest logs, filed motions, all of it took on a new meaning. Things that once seemed like technical oversights now looked like signs of a pattern. She highlighted passages, annotated inconsistencies. It wasn't just about him. It was about how the system had adjusted itself around him, how judges, clerks, and prosecutors had chosen comfort over confrontation, how paperwork had become a shield. It was tedious work. Hours passed unnoticed, files stacked higher, sticky, notes lined her desk. But Jasmine wasn't tired. She was sharpening. Then there was a knock. She looked up, already knowing who it was. The door opened, and in stepped Court Administrator Nina Beck, a woman known for her discretion and efficiency, someone Jasmine respected, but also someone who had spent her career managing perception more than truth. "May I?" Nina asked softly, already closing the door behind her. Jasmine nodded, motioning to the chair. Nina sat, adjusting her skirt and folding her hands. "I've heard what happened," she said. "And I also heard you're making inquiries." Jasmine didn't respond right away. She watched Nina carefully. You heard from who? Nina hesitated. Let's just say people are paying attention. They're concerned. About the assault? Jasmine asked. Nina's silence was telling. No, Jasmine said. They're concerned that I'm asking questions. Nina gave a faint nod. This could get complicated, Jasmine. You've worked hard to get where you are. You don't have to go through this alone, but just consider what it could cost. You, Jasmine leaned forward. I'm not afraid of cost. I'm afraid of silence, and I won't be part of it anymore. There was nothing aggressive in her tone, no hostility, just certainty. Nina stood slowly. She didn't agree, but she didn't argue. Before leaving, she looked back. Be careful, she said. This system doesn't protect the ones who try to fix it. As the door clicked shut again, Jasmine returned to her files. Her pulse was steady, her mind clear, because she already knew what Nina didn't say aloud. The system may not protect her. But she wasn't here to be protected. She was here to reveal the truth. Jasmine sat alone, surrounded by notes, documents, and a recorder that now held the beginnings of something far larger than any one case. The sun had long dipped below the horizon, casting a dim orange wash across her office. The light above her desk flickered slightly, but she didn't notice. She was focused. Every page, every detail pulling her deeper into a system she could no longer pretend to trust. She flipped through records tied to Boone, seeing now what had been hidden in plain sight. Consistent complaints, repetitive language. In reports, and the same names signing off without follow-up. Patterns, repetition, not coincidence. She wasn't just building a file. She was uncovering a system of complicity, one that had allowed misconduct to thrive by dressing it up in formal language and burying it in paper trails. Jasmine picked up her pen and began sketching it all out on a whiteboard. Timelines, people, actions, and omissions. It wasn't emotional work, it was surgical. The deeper she went, the clearer the structure of silence became. It wasn't one bad officer, it was layers of quiet cooperation, intentional or passive, that made the harm possible. As she stepped back from the board, a knock interrupted her concentration. This time, it wasn't staff. It was someone she didn't expect. Angela Harper, public defender, vocal critic of law enforcement abuses, and someone Jasmine had crossed paths with professionally but never collaborated with closely. Angela was sharp, unflinching, and never softened her views for the sake of courtroom politics. Jasmine opened the door slowly. Angela? Angela offered a firm nod. I heard, and I think you know I've been trying to expose this for years. You've got their attention now. I figured we might as well talk. Jasmine let her in. No words were needed. They sat, separated, by years of ideological distance, but suddenly aligned by purpose. Angela didn't waste time. What happened to you isn't new. It's just finally visible. And if you're serious about this, you need to understand. They'll bury you, if they can. Jasmine didn't flinch. I know. Angela leaned forward, placing a slim folder on the desk. This is what we have. Witnesses, names, incidents that didn't make it into the official record. You want to pursue this, you're going to need more than court documents. Jasmine took the folder, opened it, and saw not just stories, but evidence. Handwritten notes, photos, letters never filed, cases dismissed without explanation. This was all ignored? Jasmine asked. Angela nodded. By design. They sat in silence for a moment. Neither spoke of what it meant to go against the grain. They both knew. Finally, Jasmine said, I'm not trying to make a statement. I'm trying to make change. Angela looked her in the eye. Good, then we're on the same side. But understand, this won't be a courtroom fight. It's going to be a political one. You're stepping into a space that was built to survive exposure. Jasmine closed the folder, her voice quiet but resolute. Then it's time we see how well it holds up. Outside, the courthouse loomed in silence, but inside her office, something irreversible had begun. A judge and a defender, once divided by method, now united by necessity. And, for the first time, Jasmine wasn't just preparing a case, she was preparing for a reckoning. The next morning arrived not with calm, but with urgency. Jasmine Crockett stepped into the courthouse early, her steps echoing through hallways that were still half-lit and quiet. She carried with her a folder, worn at the edges, but heavier than it looked. It contained statements, complaints, photos, and a list of names, people who had been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced. She wasn't heading to her courtroom. She was walking toward the administrative floor to a meeting she requested just hours earlier, a closed-door session with the chief judge, Henry Langston. He was old school, careful, a man who didn't like disruption and viewed order as the highest priority. Jasmine knew exactly what she was walking into, but she also knew it was necessary. As she entered the conference room, Langston looked up from his seat at the long wooden table, already flanked by 2 senior clerks. The atmosphere was cold, professional, and unmistakably cautious. He motioned for her to sit. "Judge Crockett," he said flatly, "I understand you have concerns." Jasmine nodded and placed the folder on the table. "This isn't about concerns. It's about evidence." Langston raised an eyebrow, his hands folded. "Go on." Jasmine opened the folder and began laying out what she had found. Incident after incident involving Officer Boone. Reports that had never been pursued. Complaints filed and then quietly discarded. Statements that contradicted court testimony. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't appeal to emotion. She walked them through the timeline with the precision of someone who had prepared not just to be heard, but to be undeniable. When she finished, Langston leaned back in his chair. The clerks exchanged uneasy glances, their pens now resting on closed notebooks. "This is serious," Langston said, his tone finally shifting. "But it's also volatile." Jasmine looked him in the eye. "It's real, and the volatility comes from pretending it isn't." He tapped his fingers against the table, clearly debating his next words. "You realize what this could mean? For the department? For the court's reputation?" "Yes," she replied, "and I also know what it means if we do nothing." Langston sat in silence for a few seconds longer, then slowly closed the folder. "I'll review this in detail, but officially, I'll need more before we open anything publicly." Jasmine understood. This wasn't a no. It was a delay. A quiet effort to manage the fallout before it even began. "I'll get you more," she said, standing up. "But the truth is already out there, Henry. This time, it's not going away." She turned to leave, her back straight, her steps firm. Outside the conference room, the courthouse had begun to stir. Staff moved with purpose, attorneys carried stacks of files, and clerks typed rapidly behind glass windows. It looked like any other morning, but something had shifted. Jasmine wasn't just reacting anymore, she was leading. As she returned to her chambers, her phone buzzed. A message, just a name and a time. Someone else willing to talk. Someone ready to testify about what they'd seen Boone do and what the department had done to protect him. She added it to her growing list. The silence was breaking, and now the system that once ignored her voice would have no choice but to hear it. The witness was early. Jasmine found him waiting in a small, windowless interview room tucked behind courtroom 3. His name was Evan Pike, mid-30s, former officer, resigned under quiet circumstances 2 years prior. He sat straight in the chair, hands clasped tightly in front of him, eyes locked on the table like he was preparing for interrogation rather than conversation. Jasmine entered quietly, closing the door behind her. No introductions were needed. He knew why he was here. "Mr. Pike," she began, "thank you for coming. I know this wasn't easy." He nodded but didn't look up. I didn't leave the department because I wanted to. I left because I couldn't. Stay. Jasmine waited. Boone, he said flatly. He wasn't just protected, he was untouchable. Everyone knew it. People filed complaints, but they never went anywhere. He had people in the right places. Jasmine sat across from him, pen in hand, but not writing. She let him speak freely. I watched him plant evidence twice, Pike continued, and I said something. Not on record, just to my sergeant. A week later, I was pulled from rotation. A month later, I was pushed to desk duty. Then came the internal write-ups. By the time I left, they had a file on me thicker than the one on him. Did you ever report it formally? Jasmine asked. He finally looked up. I did, once. But the report vanished. IA said they never received it. When I followed up, I was told it must have been misplaced. But after that, I got the message. If you speak, you're gone. Jasmine wrote that down. Carefully. Why? Come forward now? She asked. Because what happened to you in that courtroom? He paused. That wasn't an outburst. That was a warning. To everyone who might step out of line. And I know what it's like to carry something like this alone. Jasmine leaned forward. You're not alone anymore. He nodded again, slower this time. I kept everything I could. Copies, notes. I'll give you what I have. But be careful. They won't just protect Boone. They'll protect the structure around him. Let me worry about that, Jasmine said quietly. Just give me the truth. Pike stood. He didn't say anything else, just gave her a small envelope and walked out. Inside were photocopies, internal memos, shift reports, statements, all unofficial but detailed. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to prove a pattern. Jasmine exhaled slowly. This wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a growing voice, a rhythm, a build. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. She placed the envelope beside the recorder, clicked it on, and said, Evan Pike, former officer, testimony received and documented. We proceed. Each new piece added to the case wasn't just building a file. It was tearing down the wall Boone and others had hidden behind, and Jasmine, calm, methodical, was moving steadily toward something that could no longer be avoided. The system was watching, and this time, she would not blink. By the end of the week, Jasmine's office had transformed into something more resembling an investigation unit than a judge's chambers. Charts lined the walls, folders covered the desk, and a private secure drive was filling fast with statements, reports, and cross-referenced cases. She wasn't building a theory, she was constructing a timeline. One incident at a time, each connected by names, by silence, by institutional indifference. Word was spreading. Quietly, yes, but it was spreading. A clerk from another courtroom slipped her a handwritten note. He cornered me once, in the stairwell. I never told anyone. If you're documenting this, I'm ready to talk. Jasmine folded the note, added it to her collection, and circled the name. Another thread. Another voice. Angela Harper returned later that day, this time with a flash drive. Footage, she said. Unofficial. Came from a contact who's no longer with the department. It never made it into any file. Jasmine reviewed it in silence. It was grainy and dimly lit, but clear enough. Boone was on screen, body tense, confronting a teenager during a traffic stop. His voice didn't rise, but his grip did. The way. He held the boy's jacket, the tone in his threats. It wasn't policing. It was domination. No charges had come from that incident. No report of force. No internal inquiry. Jasmine leaned back, watching the footage again. Every second of it spoke louder than words. Angela crossed her arms. This is what we've been screaming about. But people only listen when it's official. When the robe says it, not when the community lives it. Jasmine didn't disagree. Then it's time they start listening differently. She logged the video, noted the timestamp, and began cross-referencing the date with Boone's assignments. It matched a dismissed complaint from that same night. Officially, no misconduct found. Her hands moved quickly now, flipping through reports, aligning witness accounts with shifts, matching statements to booking logs. A pattern emerged, misconduct followed by erasure, followed by silence. But this silence was crumbling. More names surfaced, former officers, defense attorneys, even a former bailiff who requested a meeting. Each offered pieces, and Jasmine was stitching them together. Not all were dramatic. Some were as simple as altered dates, unexplained case transfers, missing footage, or overwritten digital records. But it all pointed to one conclusion. Boone wasn't rogue. He was covered, not just by colleagues, but by layers of inaction. A system that hadn't failed accidentally. It had chosen convenience over correction. Jasmine stood at the whiteboard, marker in hand, drawing the lines again. Boone in the center. Departments orbiting around him, lines stretching out like a web. It wasn't just about what he had done. It was about who had allowed it. She stepped back, studying what she had mapped out. The system, once too big to confront, was now shrinking with each piece of evidence. Not because it had changed, but because she had learned to see it clearly. And now, the question wasn't if it could fall, it was when. It was no longer just Jasmine who felt the shift. The courthouse itself had changed. Conversations grew shorter when she entered the room. Doors closed faster. Some avoided her altogether. Judges, clerks, even a few attorneys she had once shared. Warm words with. The system, sensing exposure, had begun to close ranks. But Jasmine didn't retreat. She moved through the discomfort with the same clarity that had gotten her this far. Every silent stare, every avoided glance, it confirmed she was pressing where it hurt. Inside her office, the whiteboard had become a visual indictment. Names connected by lines, incidents color-coded, gaps highlighted, places where truth had vanished under the weight of routine. And yet, with every day, those gaps narrowed. Then came the call she had been expecting. "Judge Crockett," said the voice on the other end, "this is Deputy Director Colburn with the Judicial Oversight Committee. We've received a preliminary request to review your conduct regarding recent activities, including the handling of case files not currently under docket." Jasmine's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "I'm aware of the request." Colburn paused. "This is not a formal inquiry. Not yet, but questions are being asked. About your impartiality, about boundaries. Some believe you're stepping outside your role." She didn't let the silence stretch. "And some believe I'm finally doing the job no one else was willing to." Colburn's tone remained steady. "Be careful. Good intentions don't always survive political structures." Jasmine ended the call politely, then placed the phone down with a quiet thud. It had started. The pushback. Not from Boone, not directly, but from the institution itself. The courthouse could tolerate corruption as long as it was orderly. But disruption? That was intolerable. She walked over to the window. The city outside moved on, unaware of the fault lines forming within its justice system. Jasmine had known. This would happen. Exposure always came with consequences. But she also knew she wasn't alone anymore. Angela returned later that afternoon with a new development. A journalist had reached out anonymously. Someone inside the media had caught wind of what was happening. They had seen the public record shift, court filings adjusted, and they wanted to know why. This could amplify things, Angela said, but it could also backfire. Jasmine nodded. "We won't go to them. Not yet. Not until we're ready. This can't become noise. It has to become action." She turned to the board again, added a fresh name, Colburn. The Oversight Committee wasn't just a formality anymore. It was a wall she might have to climb next. But Jasmine wasn't slowing down. The closer she got to the center, the more resistance she met. And that only meant one thing. She was getting close to something they didn't want seen. She opened a new file and labeled it System Response. This case had started with Boone, but now it was bigger than any one man. Now it was about the system itself, and whether it would be willing to defend truth or simply protect itself. The pressure was building, and Jasmine could feel it in every interaction. Meetings were shorter. Emails went unanswered. Colleagues who once greeted her with ease now kept their doors half closed. No one said it outright, but the message was clear. She was becoming a problem, but that didn't stop her. That morning, she received a message from an anonymous source. No name. Just a burner number and an attached PDF. The message read, "If you want to see how deep it goes, read this, but be ready." She opened the file slowly, already bracing herself. It was a transcript, partial but detailed. An internal, disciplinary hearing from 3 years ago involving Boone. A civilian complaint, dismissed for insufficient evidence, but buried within the transcript were redacted names, references to withheld video, and a statement from a supervising officer that simply read, "This one's above our pay grade." Jasmine sat back. The quote echoed. It wasn't just about misconduct. It was about protection from the top. She printed the file, highlighted key lines, and added it to the growing binder now labeled Undisclosed Proceedings. Each document was another brick pulled from a wall that had stood for too long without scrutiny. Angela arrived an hour later. Jasmine handed her the transcript. "This is the crack," she said. "It's small, but it confirms what we've suspected. They've been shielding him from internal." "Review." Angela flipped through the pages, her expression hardening. "This means someone at command level is involved. Maybe even beyond that." They both knew what it meant. If senior leadership had stepped in to suppress disciplinary actions, then this wasn't just about rogue decisions. It was about institutional alignment, a strategy to protect, to deny, to control. "We need more," Angela said. "If we're going to take this public, media, committee, federal review, then we can't just show one pattern. We have to show the structure." Jasmine nodded. "And I'm close. We just need one more voice from the inside, someone who was in that hearing." Angela paused. "There's one name I keep circling. Lieutenant Roy Mercer. He's retired now. Moved upstate. Quiet type. But he was head of internal affairs when that transcript was written." "Let's reach out," Jasmine said. Angela gave a small smile. "Already working on it." As she left, Jasmine stood alone again, the file still open in front of her. She wasn't just reading evidence now. She was reading the system's own language. Its deflections, its redactions, its evasions. The deeper she went, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a cover-up of misconduct. It was a method, a way of ensuring that power always stayed protected. But now the method had been exposed. And Jasmine, piece by piece, was translating it into something that couldn't be ignored. Not by oversight, not by the public, not even by the ones who had written it. 2 days later, they made contact. Lieutenant Roy Mercer agreed to meet. Not at the courthouse, not in any official building, but in a quiet diner 2 hours north. Jasmine drove there herself, no security, no entourage. Just a notebook in her bag and questions in her mind. When she arrived, Mercer was already seated in the far booth, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. His appearance was modest, gray jacket, old watch, a face lined by time but alert. He didn't smile when she approached, but he did nod, a quiet acknowledgement of what she had come to do. "Judge Crockett," he said plainly, "you've made a bit of noise." "I'm not here to make noise," she replied. "I'm here for clarity." Mercer sipped his coffee, then set it down. "You've already seen the transcript. I suppose you're wondering why that hearing never went anywhere." "I am," she said, "and I think you can tell me." He looked around the diner once, then leaned in. "That case wasn't supposed to move forward. Orders came from above, from people whose names never appear on the documents. They wanted it buried. Why?" Because Boone was useful, Mercer said. He did what others wouldn't, and that made him valuable, especially when pressure came down to clean up streets or close cases fast. He got results. How he got them didn't matter. Jasmine's expression stayed still, but her pen moved quickly. Internal Affairs raised flags more than once, Mercer continued, but every time it got shut down. Files disappeared. Witnesses changed stories. One officer was reassigned. Another took early retirement. Eventually, people stopped filing reports. "And you?" she asked. "I kept records," he said simply. "Not because I planned to use them, but because I knew, one day, someone might need to see what really happened." He slid an envelope across the table. Inside were scanned documents, old case notes, internal memos, all pointing to systematic obstruction. Not a single smoking gun, but enough to confirm her worst suspicions. Mercer leaned back. "You're not just poking the bear. You're walking into its den. And when this breaks, because it will, it won't stop with Boone. It'll reach everyone who let it happen." "I'm ready for that," Jasmine said quietly. He studied her for a moment, then nodded again. "Then take this. But don't try to win the whole war in one blow. Piece by piece. Truth travels better when it's consistent." Jasmine stood, thanked him, and left with the envelope clutched in her hand. As she drove back, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the highway. The documents on the seat beside her felt heavier than anything she'd carried since this began. Not just because of what they proved, but because of what they demanded. She wasn't chasing justice anymore. She was dragging it, inch by inch, into the light. And now she had enough to make them listen. By Monday morning, Jasmine Crockett returned to the courthouse with a plan. She had no press release, no announcement, no entourage, only a sealed binder and the quiet confidence of someone who had done her homework. She walked directly into the Office of Judicial Oversight and handed the binder to the director's assistant. "Tell Colburn this is formal," she said. "He'll know what to do with it." Inside that binder was everything. Mercer's records, Pike's statement, redacted transcripts, case inconsistencies, and timelines. It wasn't framed as an accusation. It was structured as a report. Facts layered in sequence, no exaggeration, no missing links. This wasn't noise, it was strategy. The news reached Colburn fast. Within the hour, his office called. "Judge Crockett," he said, more composed than before, "we received your materials. We'll initiate a formal internal review." Jasmine knew the language. Internal review didn't guarantee results, but it meant acknowledgement. And acknowledgement was the first crack in any institution's armor. That afternoon, she returned to her courtroom. The building felt different now. Not safer, but clearer. People still avoided eye contact, but not all. One clerk gave her a brief nod. A junior attorney met her gaze unflinching. The quiet was no longer avoidance. It was anticipation. As she reviewed the day's docket, Angela stepped into her chambers. "It's spreading," she said. "Word got out, and not just about Boone. People are asking about the court's role, the silence, the missing files." Jasmine didn't look up from her papers. "Good." Angela dropped a folded paper onto her desk, an article draft. "They're going to print, with or without you. Reporter says they'll name the pattern, not the people, at least not yet." Jasmine scanned the headline. "A System of Silence. Patterns of Protection in Charleston Law Enforcement." "They want a comment," Angela said. Jasmine leaned back. "Let them publish, but no comment, not yet. Truth first, voice after." Angela nodded, clearly satisfied. "We're close, but you know what's coming, right?" Jasmine didn't hesitate. They'll push back, hard. And she was right. By evening, an anonymous letter arrived. No name. Just typed lines. "You're making mistakes. This isn't your job. If you keep going, you'll lose everything. There was no signature, just that threat. Jasmine read it once, then she filed it, under a new label, Resistance, because threats weren't new to her, and silence had never been safety. She stepped to her board again, added a new name, circled it, and began drawing lines outward. The map wasn't finished yet, but the system was starting to unravel. By the time the article went live, it had already begun circulating in private groups, shared between community organizers, legal professionals, and journalists who'd been chasing the same story for years but lacked the platform to push it forward. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to read the article twice. She had lived every word of it. The piece didn't name Boone directly, but it didn't have to. It laid out the chain of events with surgical precision, patterns of misconduct, retracted reports, judicial hesitation, and administrative silence. It referenced a judge currently reviewing systemic breakdowns in Charleston and mentioned multiple confirmed witnesses. No exaggeration, no assumptions, just facts, organized the way Jasmine had presented them. The reaction was immediate. Emails flooded the courthouse, some angry, some grateful, some anonymous. A few accused her of betrayal. Others thanked her for finally making the invisible visible. Outside, a small group of protesters gathered near the courthouse steps. They weren't shouting. They held signs. Words like, "We remember," and "No more silence." Inside her chambers, Jasmine stood at the window, watching them. This wasn't spectacle. This was response. A shift. A public that no longer accepted silence as policy. Angela entered, phone in hand. The Oversight Committee just issued a formal statement. They're launching an external review, federal assistance included. Jasmine nodded, her voice calm. It had to happen. Angela paused, then added, "Boone's been placed on administrative leave, effective immediately." Jasmine finally turned from the window. That's a start, but they both knew this wasn't over. That afternoon, a knock came at her door. Unexpected. When she opened it, she found Judge Langston, hands behind his back, eyes unreadable. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. "I read the article," he said. "I read your report, and I've been hearing a lot from people who want to know if you're trying to dismantle this institution." Jasmine didn't blink. "I'm not trying, I'm succeeding. The question is whether this institution wants to change or collapse." Langston was silent. Then, "You've made a lot of people uncomfortable." "So did the truth," she replied. He sighed and shook his head, not out of anger but out of the realization that something irreversible had occurred. "You've changed the direction of this court, Judge Crockett, and not everyone is ready for that." "I didn't ask for permission." "No, you didn't," he said, turning toward the door. "And maybe that's what makes this real." As he left, Jasmine stood in the quiet once again, but it no longer felt isolating. The silence now had purpose. She returned to her desk, opened the next file, and began preparing her schedule for the week. There were more cases to hear, more truths to surface, more people waiting to be seen. Because justice, as it turned out, didn't collapse with exposure. It began. Weeks passed, but the momentum didn't slow. The external review turned internal silence into documented failure. Committees met behind closed doors. Records long considered sealed were opened. Staff were called in for interviews. Some stepped down quietly. Others denied involvement. But the narrative had already shifted, one that could no longer be reshaped by spin or redirected by vague statements. What had once been described as an unfortunate anomaly was now understood as a sustained failure, and Jasmine Crockett's name, once whispered in corners, now carried weight outside courtroom walls. Not as a whistleblower, not even as a judge. but as a reckoner. She remained at her post, hearing cases, signing orders, upholding her role. But no longer within the confines of a comfortable script. Her courtroom had become a place where silence was no longer policy. Every attorney, every officer, every witness who entered now understood the shift. Procedure still mattered, but so did truth, and Jasmine ensured both had equal footing. The media turned its focus elsewhere eventually, on to the next scandal, the next controversy. But the foundation she laid didn't fade with headlines. Internally, training manuals were rewritten. Oversight was no longer optional. And most importantly, people had begun to speak, clerks, interns, legal aides, realizing that one voice could in fact move a system if it stayed steady long enough. Angela moved on to help launch a legal network dedicated to systemic reform. Pike was reinstated, not as an officer, but as a civilian oversight consultant. Mercer's records became part of a formal archive, accessible by court order, no longer locked in back rooms. As for Boone, his case was referred for prosecution. The result remained pending, but his era of impunity had ended. Jasmine never asked to be a symbol. She never wanted recognition, but she accepted what her role had become, not the face of resistance, but its framework. One morning, as she reviewed her docket, she found a note slipped between two case files, handwritten, unsigned. It read simply, "Because of you, I didn't stay quiet." She folded the note carefully and placed it in her drawer, not as a keepsake, but as a reminder. This wasn't the end. It was the result of choosing discomfort over compliance, truth over tradition, and it proved what Jasmine had always believed. Deep down, even when the system tried to convince her otherwise, change doesn't begin with permission. It begins with one person who decides not to look away.